State of the Meta Nitro Boost. Drop it in your engine. Playing a game of Hot Pursuit, and we won't stop until we're done.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we walk through the 4th week of Aetherdrift Standard. Alrighty folks, 80 top 8s and 10 trophies came out this past weekend from major tournaments, with all 10 of them evolving the metagame. To nobody's surprise, Esper Pixies came out on top, snagging 15 top 8 spots in 4 of those trophies, which means it took 40% of all trophies at major tournaments this weekend. Once more, we have dominance at the top by Pixies.
Coming in second, though, is Omni Combo with 6 top 8s and 2 trophies of its own. We've been waiting a long time for Combo to emerge in this meta, and we finally got our front runner. Get ready, folks. I don't see this one disappearing anytime soon.
Third place goes to Xur's Domain, surging back into Tier 1 land after an off week, this time on the back of 7 top 8s and a single trophy. The build continues to kind of shift those flex slots, but if Pixies continues its reign of terror, expect Domain to step in and hedge hard against it.
Dimir Midrange rounds out our Tier 1 options with 5 top 8s, 1 shiny piece of hardware. Dimir continues to confound everything that isn't red-based aggro or dedicated Pixies, making it a risky but strong choice depending on your local meta.
We kick off Tier 2 with Dimir Bounce, a deck that was seemingly dead since Aetherdrift came out, but rose this past weekend from the grave with 4 top 8s and a trophy of its own. Who said that Kaido can't hop?
And next up is Mono Red Aggro with 9 top 8s but 0 trophies. Mono Red has taken pretty much the end boss position in many a tournament, but continues to come up short as the hate for it remains consistent.
Not wrong there, Max. Gruul Mice drops to 7th place in the tier list this week with a mere 7 top 8s and 0 trophies. Can Gruul find a way through the temporary lockdown heavy metagame? The archetype will need to evolve to have a shot at regaining its former glory.
Rounding out our tier list is Jeskai Oculus with 4 top 8s but not a trophy in sight. Eye in the Sky continues to underwhelm as graveyard-based strategies ask the question, if we can reanimate Oculus, why not just go for Omniscience and win on the spot?
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll take a look at Azorius Affinity and Orzhov Control, 2 archetypes fresh off RCQ top 8s.
And I'll be highlighting the update to Boros Burn and Squirming Emergence, each with some strong finishes this past weekend. But let's shift gears now, fire off our Tier 1 breakdowns, beginning with Esper Pixie.
Sneaky Masato won the 70-player MTGO challenge on Sunday with Esper Pixie, notching yet another trophy for the archetype, and let's see where they shifted things. So, if you haven't been in the know, you've watched as StockUp has just started to climb in value every week. All the decks connected to Blue are starting to use it. It's kind of become the new this town ain't big enough, but for Aetherdrift. And as you see here, there's 3 copies in the main, 1 in the sideboard. This is going to be a standard staple till rotation, folks, so if you haven't picked up your playset, pick it up, draft it up, whatever you got to do, you're going to need 4. There's a 1/1 solidified position here of Destroy Evil and Go for the Throat. I love that. Momentum Breaker as a 2-of also makes a great deal of sense. The 24th land has also come in. Now that we have stock up, now that we're a little bit more grindy, a little bit more mid-range, we've gone up on that. But the piece I really want you to pay attention to is the 2 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil sitting in that sideboard, because that is part of the plan to deal with Baloths and Lieges post-board. You just rip it out of their hand before they ever get to use it from Hopeless Nightmare.
Okay. So I do see that Optimistic Scavenger is back in the deck, at least this iteration this week. Why do you suspect there's a return of that card in this iteration?
I think ultimately what we're trying to do with Esper Pixies is be quick, right? An Optimistic Scavenger is our Heartfire hero. It is a card that, if left unchecked, unanswered, grows our board state in a very quick manner and allows us to overwhelm opponents. The prior builds that were going without it and we're pushing those creatures into the main had a very specific meta I think that they were hedging for, and now that we're back to a meta that has a little bit more diversity, and as you see in the top 4 there, you've got Pixie, you've got a combo deck, you've got a ramp deck, and you've got kind of a mid-range deck too. So you're starting to see more of the diversity as the aggro decks fall into tier 2. So that tells me that Optimistic Scavenger has a better than average chance of making it to turn 2 itself. And in turn, that speeds up your clock, which you need against them.
Okay, let's switch gears over to a deck that also, if left unanswered, can become a huge problem. Omni Combo.
apologies if I butcher the name, Hirayama Rei took down the 178-player 30th God of Standard Tournament in Tokyo, Japan this past Friday with Omni Combo, cementing its meteoric rise from obscurity to Tier 1 status, Max. Let's talk about why. First and foremost, this is the optimized mana base, okay? 2 Blast Zone makes a lot of sense when you're going up against Mono Red and Pixies. That's why it's there. It's also pretty handy against those Rest in Pieces post board. Gives you just a couple more slots to move around with. Let's also look that we have a consolidated creature base. We're done with Picklock Prankster. We are playing, however, an Oracle of Tragedy, and I think that is a really clever call right now because you get to a point in the game where you can just shuffle back in those Abuelo's Awakenings, where you can shuffle back in Omniscience, where you can shuffle back in Invasion of Arcavios, where you can shuffle back in Stock-Ups and Afara's Dispersals and Temp Lockdowns and Confounding Riddles. And the point of that is that the mill plan isn't quite as effective against you if you plan ahead for it. And it also gives you the ability to get some of those cards back that you maybe accidentally milled and you need to get back as the game runs long.
That makes a ton of sense. This deck continues to confound me as I look at it, but it looks like some slots have solidified, especially those Riptide Gearhulks. But let me ask you a question. A card I'm not seeing that seems to have been in it for quite some time. Why does this iteration get away from Season of Weaving? Is that card too clunky, or what's going on?
I think a huge part of it is that you may not need it with what they're trying to do. This is a build that's a little bit heavier on the sideboard plan and the wishboard plan, and it really embraces that by having this town ain't big enough instead, and saying, okay, if we have this town ain't big enough, we can just loop that with Invasion to bounce the whole board anyway. So if you're playing in a paper tournament, that's a lot less clunky than Season of Weaving bouncing the whole board at once, and perhaps that's a huge part of why we're doing it that way. Because you can just say, okay, any responses? No, fair enough. This town loop, we're just going to do this till your whole board state's gone, and then we're going to get to winning here, all right? So I think that's part of why it's a little bit less clunky in exchange for being better in paper, I suppose, to give you less carpal tunnel.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have to bear in mind the carpal tunnel that this deck creates when you're trying to play with it. So yeah, any way to make it easier and not finish, past time with a combo deck makes a lot of sense to me, honestly. But talking about going big, decks that, go big, go long, go hard, let's talk about Zer's Domain.
Matt RL smashed through the 73-player Reese queue at SCG Charlotte on Saturday with Zer's Domain, pushing this archetype back into Tier 1 territory with emphasis. Now, let's look at this hedge here, gang. We have a main board Obstinate Baloth. We have finally hit the point where people are just like, screw it, there's enough Pixies. We're playing it in the main. We're done waiting to see if we get it in the board. So that's how much Pixies we're seeing. However, we're not noting any pest control in the main. There are a couple in the sideboard, but it's still somewhat of a soft hedge here with the Baloth, because Baloth is still good against a number of other archetypes, such as Mono Red, Gruul Mice, etc. The lockdowns here, I also want to put a note in that lockdown, when you're playing control, is not great against Pixies. They're going to bounce it, right? But when you're playing a ramp deck like this, the payoff is much higher because you're just trying to buy time. Like, your game plan is so much bigger than theirs that you're fine if they bounce this for value, as long as next turn you get to go Zur, Animate, Swing. That's really all you're needing to do with temporary lockdown is a stutter step. And I wanted to clarify that because so many people I see are like, well, lockdown was terrible against Pixies in Azorius Control. Yes, it was, because you don't have a way to ramp past. But with this deck, you do.
Yeah, that's some needed nuance that you introduced to this discussion. Thank you for that. But I want to ask about the copy of Stock Up. Now that Domain is using this card, we're seeing it in a lot of other decks. Does that mean that Domain needs to grind even further?
I think it's appropriate to just look at Stock Up and say, okay, this is dig through time with different restrictions, right? It's sorcery speed, it isn't going to delve, it isn't going to be double blue, and it's probably going to cost 3 mana, not 2, right? But at the same time, you're digging 5 cards deep and grabbing 2 of them, which makes it halfway to a heavy impulse, right? And that's what I think they're trying to do. Like, Beans is great, but you get to these positions with Domain where you're just drawing kind of dead off the top, and what you really need is a Wrath effect or an Overlord or a Zur, but a very specific card off the top. And this Stock Up, it speaks to that. The fact that we need to not have clunky draws, we need to be able to thin through and find the relevant cards, because the relevant cards are all heavy hitters. So it isn't necessarily that we need a crap load of card advantage so much as we need the right cards at the right time.
That makes a ton of sense considering its historic use of Analyze the Pollen as well. It's definitely looking for its pieces to win and go over the top. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Talk to us now about the last deck in our Tier 1 archetypes, Dimir Midrange.
Oink Mage 22 took down the 55-player MTGO challenge last Thursday with Dimir Midrange, elevating the archetype back to Tier 1 for a week as the meta churns. Let's look at why. So Dimir Midrange looks great when Azorius Control, Domain, and a whole host of Tier 2 decks are running around in the metagame, when decks such as Omniscience are in the metagame. This is a disruptive tempo deck with card advantage that snowballs very quickly, and that's a difficult access for other decks to operate within. Now, I look at this, and we're pre-hedged for aggro, which tells you just how rough the red matchup is, that they're like, all right, we need 3 Preachers, we need the Shelly. Like, we can't just go into the 4th Curiosity, we can't go into Tidebinder's main. Aggro's that hard, and that's been true for this deck for a long time. Gruul Mice is what originally knocked it out because they just ground through it with Paw Patch Recruits, with Questing Druids, with Innkeeper's Talent. And so if this deck is moving back into Tier 1 territory, it could spell a churn in the meta that pushes Gruul back on top. But if they've solved the red matchup, that's been the thing that's kept this in check for a long time. So that's really the question when I look at this. Like, can we beat red at a 60 to 70% clip with this list? If so, okay.
That's a very interesting question. Domain has had to answer that question as well in its rise. So, I mean, why can't Dimir Midrange do the same thing? But we're seeing this, and we're seeing its cousin Dimir Bounce in the meta as well. And it's been a minute since we've seen both decks so close in the meta and the tier list. Talk to us about sort of the difference between bringing Dimir Bounce, which seems a little bit lighter, and bringing Dimir Midrange. What sort of local metas are you looking for to answer that question?
If I'm going to see a lot of Domain, if I'm going to see a lot of Control, if I'm going to see slower decks, if I'm going to see combo decks, I want Dimir Midrange. If I'm expecting Bounce, like Pixies, if I'm expecting more in the sense of aggro decks, that's where I want Dimir Bounce, because those 4 nowhere to run start to do some real damage in that scenario. And it's just a little bit better equipped to control and maintain against those decks because of this town ain't big enough, bouncing back those giant Heartfire heroes and just preventing that easy snowballing that Gruul Mice typically does if you can't answer the threat right away. So I like it better against aggro if you're going for Dimir Bounce.
Okay, great answer. I'm with you on that one. And let's talk about Dimir Bounce. We're going to jump down into Tier 2, and I'll start things off with Dimir Bounce. So Josh Gilchrist won the 87-player RCQ at SCG Charlotte over the weekend with Dimir Bounce, breathing new life into this dying archetype. But let's take a look at the update since we saw it last. The first thing I want to mention, we're seeing a very consolidated main board. Instead of seeing 2 copies of this, 3 copies of that here and there, we're seeing what the deck wants to go for. It's got, 4 copies of very specific cards. No Grim Baubles. We're not experimenting with that card. Instead, we're on full Hopeless Nightmare, trying to win the resource war. We're on full set copies of Nowhere to Run, hoping to bounce those, reuse them, really grind down the opponent's board state. We're seeing a 3-2 split of Kaido to Enduring Curiosity. Still very high in number for those cards. We're still trying to focus our mid game around those cards. Not the 3-3 split we used to see those. We're starting to see that we have to hedge in different directions. Speaking of which, we've got the 2 Preachers in the sideboard against your aggro matchups. That tends to do really well. And also in that regard, we've got the single Gixis command, 2 copies of Malicious Eclipse in the sideboard as well, hedging for the post-board aggro game plan.
So, Max, I look at that list and I wonder, do we want Entity Tracker? Do we want Oil Deep Gear Hulk? There are these cards that we've seen go in and out depending on the build. Where are you at with it?
Well, I can answer each of these. For NTT Tracker, we're looking really, the deck has for a while now focused on Enduring Curiosity. I think that's just a better body. It achieves the same sort of card advantage, but it has more longevity than NTT Tracker. Really, and if you're looking at the 3-drop slot, Kaido is really the play you want to go with. You start with your evasive creatures. You want to bring in Kaido on turn 3. You've got 8 possible turn 1, turn 2 creatures, some of those with evasion, of course. So indicative that Dimir Bounce really just wants to curve into that card. Now, as for Oil Deep Gear Hulk, with the way that we're hedged against trying to disrupt those bigger decks, like Domain, right, with the board wipes. I certainly wouldn't be against a Gear Hulk or two in the sideboard for those matchups. With that card, you're going to be able to continue your aggression through the curve and ideally be able to remove like a Sunfall or, some kind of Planeswalker removal from the opponent's hand. So just that little bit of disruption could be enough to push through, and I think Gear Hulk does achieve that.
Fair enough. Well, let's talk about a deck that hates to see Gear Hulk coming. Mono Red Aggro.
All right, forgive me for the pronunciation. Manalasau, not sure, but made it to the finals of Saturday's 58-player MTGO Challenge with Mono Red Aggro. Look, we've talked about this particular iteration of the list. It's very close to the iterations we spoke about last week and weeks prior. Consolidated, get 'em dead red. We've been seeing this sort of iteration a lot recently. We've got the full set of Screaming Nemesis. That card is really good in the mirror and really good in the matchups against Gruul Aggro. And also 2 copies of Frenzy main board. This list uses the full set of Sunspine links in the side, really punishing the 3-color decks, the Pixie decks, really punishing Domain, and it's just enough damage in a lot of cases to go over the top at the very end there. We're also, interestingly enough, seeing 2 copies of Pyroclasm in the sideboard for your Swarm strategies, for your, in case you run into Jeskai Convoke, in case you run into, Esper Pixie in some cases. So this deck, it is resilient and it has those options available to it to be able to hedge against those really popular matchups.
That's fair. Now, Max, you talked a little bit about resilience there, but I'm not seeing Case of the Crimson Pulse. I'm not seeing Questing Druid. Are we worried about the grind capability of this into anything that's like black-based mid-range that's going to have a ton of removal?
I am. I personally am. I do like, especially Case of the Crimson Pulse, because you don't really have to tinker with the mana base too much for it, as opposed to Questing Druid. But I like both of those cards for that reason. I believe we need at least 2 to 3 copies of, at least Case in the sideboard for the grind. The grind is where we're at. We're not in the super hyper aggro meta that we were in about a month ago anymore. You're gonna have to deal with board wipes. You're gonna have to deal with your stuff getting bounced. You're gonna be tempoed. So be able to grind as hard as those decks. I think you do need an option like Case of the Crimson Pulse. Swaths of the meta are being taken up by archetypes that are trying to really just keep you down, tempo you, grind you out, and win the resource war. So yeah, I like that card for that reason.
I'm right there with you. In a world filled with temporary lockdown, play a 3-drop that keeps giving you an Ancestral every turn. Why not? Why not? But speaking of decks that like to grind a little bit harder, let's talk about Gruul.
All right. NV Rev R Aftermath. I've probably read that wrong. Got to the finals of Saturday's 87-player RCQ at SCG Charlotte with Gruul Mice, proving that the little guys are down but not out. Running, but not out of the running at all by any means, really. Let's take a look at this build, though. This deck appears to be going slightly more aggressive from the iteration we saw last week. There's a little bit of nuance here in the tuning, but we are back to a full set of Burst Lightning, so that hit them in the face, win the match kind of mindset has entered into Gruul Mice. Interestingly enough, we're seeing no Lithomanic Barrages in the sideboard. That's an interesting development. Instead, we're seeing 4 copies of Torch the Tower, a much more generic anti-aggro sort of single hit removal card. Is this an indication that we're just not going to see Convoke? We're not worried about the Convoke matchup? I'm not sure. But we are up to 1 more, bringing us to a full set of Nemesis from last week. Again, I said this was great in the mirror, great against the other red-based decks. We're down to 1 Obliterating Bolt, whereas we had like 3 last week. We're up 1 Frenzy, and we're up to a 23rd land. Down utility lands to 5. So all that is an indication that this deck, it's hedging towards a different kind of meta, and it's wanting to win the mirror. It's encountering a lot of mono red. We were talking about how mono red is the boss in a lot of these events. So yeah, it's expecting to see quite a bit of the mirror and quite a bit of mono red.
Now, I look at this build, Max, and this is actually pretty close to where we were, I'd say about a month ago. I don't think this is more than a few cards off, actually, but I'm not seeing any Sunspine links in the sideboard. Is there a reason for that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think with the mana base that this deck is trying to pack, I think it's really that simple. We're getting punished almost just as much as the other decks are when we play the Sunspine Link. So I think that's the major reason. The other side reason is I feel like with the changes we're seeing this week, the deck is geared more towards winning those aggro mirror matchups, minus the swarm strategies because we're not seeing cards against Convoke. But the full Torch the Towers, No pyroclasms or litho barrages at the same time kind of indicates that it's trying to hedge against that matchup, and so you're not going to do too much damage to a mono red with Sunspine Links.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, speaking of decks where Sunspine Links doesn't belong, despite being in red, Jeskai Oculus, let's talk about it.
Mori Hiromasa went all the way to the semifinals of the 178-player 30th God of Standard tournament in Japan. I love the way they name their tournaments. In Japan with Jeskai Oculus. Let's see how the meta overseas evolved this archetype. So we're looking here at 4 copies of Spyglass Siren instead of what we saw with last week with Storm Chaser's talent. Those evasive creatures, those evasive bodies do matter a lot, especially when you're using a full set of Proph's Eidetic Memory. You can grow those evasive creatures, get in a bunch of damage. So it just works really well in conjunction with those. We're seeing 1 copy of Get Lost in the main over the 2 Destroy Evils we saw last week. Really, I think Get Lost sees play because of the diversification of threats. You hate giving away map tokens, but you love being able to kill a Kaido, get rid of an enchantment, get rid of very specific cards that are really problematic in those matchups. So we're also seeing, interestingly, the Filigree Silex, 2 copies of that and 2 copies of Pyroclasm in the sideboard to handle, Swarm strategies. I suspect also to handle the Pixie strategies. No bitter reunions. We're starting to see the deck sort of consolidate around specific cards like NT. We're down 1 Spell Pierce, up 1 NT. Indicates a little bit more of an aggressive shell, I want to say, and also the 2 Otterball Elite, which I don't think we saw last week.
Yeah, I love the Kitsas. Those are clever. The Filigree Silex, though, Max, we could be running Blast Zone. It would be uncounterable. Why do you think Silex belongs over that right now?
Because we're a 3-color deck. I think it comes down to that. Silex doesn't affect our mana base as far as what we're having to play. Blast Zone is a utility land. And we're very much a 3-color deck. We're deep into all 3 colors. It's not like we're just splashing for one of them. So we're also seeing slight changes in the mana base to sort of reflect that. No Elegant Parlor. We're seeing the blue-red Pain land instead. And utility lands just in general feel out of reach for a low-curve deck in 3 colors like Jeskai Oculus wants to present. So I think it's just the mana base.
That's fair. Being red, white, and blue isn't all it's cracked up to be sometimes. But with that, we're going to move things along and talk about Brewer's Corner, favorite segment every week. Max, why don't you kick it off and tell us a little bit about Boros Burn?
So Matthew Schlesinger top-aided 73-player RCQ at SCG Charlotte with Boros Burn. Kind of a fun burn list to take on, especially since we have Boros Charm back in Standard. So, they can't target your creatures effectively if most of your spells aren't creatures, they're spells. So we've got full sets of Bolt Wave, full sets of Burst Lightning, Shock, Boros Charm, Lightning Strike. We're really going to hit them in the face with this deck. That's what we want to do. And the creatures we do have work in conjunction with those spells pretty well. Of course, we've got the 4 Hired Claws, but we've also got Swift Spear and the return of Slickshot Show Off, along with your 4 Nemesis. We already talked about the value of that, especially in mirror matchups. The deck really just turns away the idea of using the mouse package synergy to be a more direct-to-face damage output sort of list. It doesn't fall to the same, board wipe, single target removal, all that kind of disruption that the other decks are going to be using against you typically. It feels well-suited to tackle Esper Pixie as well. Hating it out is not the same as hating out, some of the other red-based aggros like I just said. So this one might squeak through. And, case of the Crimson Pulse, feeling pretty strong here in the meta, especially post-board.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really like the way they set this up. Esper Pixie is such a painful mana base. There are a number of games that we look at and we're just like, oh, there's 3 pain lands, and we just have to try to survive against aggro on 3 pain lands, and it's brutal. So Burn's a great way to punish that mindset. All the greed that's in the format with these mana bases, Burn does such an efficient job of just punishing the hell out of it. So I love where they went with this, and I appreciate that they didn't go into Sunspine Links and they went into Urbrask's Forge and just said,
yes.
you have authority or you can get wrecked. You know what I mean? Like, I love that they're just going all in on it and saying, find the answers in time or get got, But
Exactly.
With that, let's pivot over and talk about Azorius Affinity. Sven Mehelholz, top 8 of an RCQ in Germany. Sorry if I butchered your name. This is such a cool deck. I've been waiting to see if somebody would figure out Affinity. We have, of course, out of Aetherdrift, Memory Guardian, and of course Voyage Home. This is the coolest list I've seen so far. I love that we're finally finding a home for Swooping Lookout too. This was another card that's been kind of a pet for me for a really long time. The fact that we get to play Dollmaker Shop and Porcelain Gallery as our like weird version of Virtue of Loyalty here is so spicy. Just such a cool card. Has not found a home traditionally. Finally a spot where they're like, oh no, we'll slam all 4 copies in this bitch. We're doing it. So I love where they went with that. And finally, a home for Urza. Like, we've been sitting here looking at this card for how long, Max, thinking, what a cool card, never going to find a home in Standard. Except in this case, it very much did. So I love that this is kind of that tempo fish plant. It's like Azorius Cookies, but it's got a little bit more of a pop-off factor with Memory Guardian and Voyage Home. The only thing I want people to consider with a list like this is what if you ran forward Leyline Axe in the main? Because that does bump your affinity count and your tempo. All I'm going to say, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there. Just putting it out there.
Hey, it's yeah, let's do it. Leyline Axe, love it. I loved running that in Azorius Artifacts. I think it has a home here as well. Notably, the Vigilance creature, the 1-drop Vigilance creature, Vigilance getting around Ride's End. So Vigilance's stock is going up as well. So notable include there. I like that. But let's move on and talk about the next deck I want to present, Squirming Emergence. Dan Schley, top 8 in RCQ in New Jersey with this list. Love to see any kind of Reanimator, any kind of deck like that be able to perform well. That means we're in a fun meta. And Atraxa by turn 3 is nothing to scoff at. That's devastating in just about any matchup. A Valgavoth turn 3, that's wild, and you can do that with this deck. We've got well-positioned 1-drops for the meta here. I want to note with Haywire Might, anti-artifact, anti-enchantment, Duress, Cut Down. Those are all going to put in work. We've got our Reanimator targets, the 3 copies of Atraxa, the 1 copy of Valgavoth, and 2 copies of Omniscience. Omniscience not seeing enough play in these decks with Reanimator. I think that card is pretty devastating if you can get it out. We've also got 2 Jaces, well positioned, of course, against one of our top contenders' domain. We've got the Harvester of Misery, 1 in the main, 1 in the side. Really great cards versus aggro, especially when you can reanimate it. And spicy will include 3 Drag to the Roots. Interesting piece of removal that works really well in this shell, also available here. So spicy list, very cool. Love Reanimator decks. Let's see how far this one goes.
It's got a lot of tuning still to be done. I feel like we've somewhat abandoned Squirming Emergence for quite a while now, so I'm curious to see if somebody revives the archetype, evolves it a little further, and sees if it's a real contender again, Max. But let's go to the final deck in our Brewer's Corner, Orzhov Control. So, credit to Robert Graves, top-aided an 87-player RCQ at SCG Charlotte with this list, and it is quite a fun one. This is about as teched for a meta as you can get, folks. When you are playing main deck Cranial Extraction, you've called your shot. You know what I mean? Like, that is what that is. That is saying, okay, we expect a lot of Jace in this meta. Let's just get rid of it as fast as we can. And you have 6 Cranial effects in the main between Deadly Cover-Ups, The End, and Vendetta. That's a lot of ways to exile cards, which works perfectly with good old Ketramose, the New Dawn. This is the engine. This is what we're talking about. This is what everybody's talking about. I apologize if this deck becomes like tier 1 because this card is $60 a piece right now, and it's not going down, folks. You crack this in Aetherdrift, I don't care if you're not in the colors, just take it because it's worth 4 drafts on its own. You know what I mean? Like, that's just where we're at. Ketramose is that good. I don't know that I love all the slots here, but I love the logic behind a lot of what it's trying to do.
Yeah, and Mazebind Tome is such an enabler for a deck like this. So, love to see Mazebind Tome be the core of a control list like this one. So, very interesting. We've been trying to crack Ketramose for some time now. Maybe Orzhov Control is really the way to go. We'll see.
Absolutely. And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, once more, we looked at 12 archetypes going into our recap. What are you playing going into Week 5 of Aetherdrift Standard?
So I'm going to be real with y'all. I'm taking this deck into paper, into Arena Ladder. You're going to see me with Zur's Domain. So my particular iteration, the discussions around it, I've, for a while now, I've actually decided to go a little bit red with this deck. One of the big reasons is access to Pyroclasm, turn 2, turn 3. This really shores up a key weakness that Domain has always had against Swarm strategies and against underneath, hyper aggro serve strategies. And you're going to surprise your opponent when you pop this and they're like, what? I didn't expect that at all out of Domain. Also red for the Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, 2 copies of. And I like this card specifically because it makes your Zur play lethal. You've already got the 4 damage you've popped them for. When you activate this and bring it in, it's going to pop for another 4 damage in addition to whatever damage you're hitting, with your other Overlords as well. So that's generally enough to do lethal. I like the Zur play to be lethal instead of, having to sit around and see if they Sunfall me next turn. Cavern of Souls, 2 copies in here. I think it's a must right now. Control is actually countering our Zur, countering our Overlord. So I think Cavern of Souls is going to come back into mind here. As for the control matchup, 3 Tidebinders, 2 negates in the sideboard. You have to stop Jace. You just have to stop Jace because then that card makes your Beanstalks into a liability. And brief note, Frillback, Rest in Peace are also in here because I'm paying attention to the graveyard strategies. You've got them. You've got Oculus. You've got Omni Combo. You've got Delirium. Even there are several graveyard strategies still out there. So don't ignore your graveyard hate in your sideboard.
Absolutely. And I love the Overlord of the Boiler Bilges for 2 reasons, Max. One, that 4 damage does kill your opponent's Zur as well. And like you said, this is a build that doesn't have to try and wait and play the Jace game. It can just play, okay, we've got 7 mana, we've got a Cavern that'll let Zur through. Who cares? We've got some Overlords just sitting there. Perfect. Zur, animate, 20. Game. You know what I mean? Like, it is so hard to deal with that red Overlord if it comes off Zur, like you said. That's 13 points coming right at you real quick. But with that, deck I'm going for this week, Orzhov Ketamine. And yes, I'm going to call Ketramose decks Ketamine decks forever. So I changed the build a little bit. I wanted to make sure that we had Ancient Vendetta, but I just don't believe it's correct in a main board with this much Pixies. It's a dead draw against them. Similarly, I didn't like the 4 temporary lockdowns in the main because, once again, when you're playing Control and not Domain, lockdown is a liability against Pixies. So instead, we hedged it a little bit harder. We added in some more Ride's End so that we had a little bit more ways to contain aggro in the main without messing up that Pixies matchup, and more ways to trigger Ketramose, which I like. Outside of that, this list hasn't changed a ton, but you'll see the 4 Wiltleaf Lieges sitting in the sideboard. Pixies is number 1. It took 40% of all the trophies. You have to beat it right now. So yeah, I'm going to hard hedge it. I'm going to hard hedge it all the way, get all 4 Lieges coming in off the board. I'm going to get those pest controls too. And we're going to say, all right, we've got at least 6 cards coming in against Pixies, all of which are heavy hitters, all of which can alter the nature of the matchup, on top of a deck that is already very, very good at grinding.
I think you're correct to go in that direction. I think you're also correct to go 2-color rather than the builds that have been tinkered with so far. Easy mana base means you're going to have access to your cards much easier, and you need that against Pixie. You need to be able to on the spot call up the solution. So yeah, I like where this build is hedged, especially against Esper Pixie, which, my gosh, that deck just does not stop. So you got to find some way to stop it. And this deck is well positioned, I must say. But that does it. That's another week in the books, folks. Thank you for allowing us into your homes for 99 episodes. Be sure to tune in next week where we're going to be celebrating 100 episodes of Stay the Meta.
Oh yeah. Last but not least, please like, share, comment on this video, show some support for your MTG community, and we appreciate having you all here. Until next time, Rebels, untap, upkeep, resist.